He was sure of his victory when he brought his pregnant mistress to a family dinner. He thought he was in control until his wife pulled out documents that changed everything. Subscribe and post in the comments where you're watching from. The chandelier above the grand ballroom sparkled like a constellation frozen in time. The floor beneath it, polished to a perfect mirror sheen, reflected the glittering gowns and finely tailored tuxedos of the guests who moved through the space with effortless elegance. Laughter mingled with the soft clinking of champagne flutes, the murmur of expensive conversations filling the air with a hum of wealth and self-importance. At the center of it all stood Victor Lancaster, his presence commanding attention as he exchanged firm handshakes and nods with men whose last names carried weight, whose family empires had existed for generations. Beside him, poised and graceful as always, stood Camille Harris Lancaster. Tall, with skin that gleamed like polished mahogany under the golden light, she wore a gown of deep emerald silk that hugged her curves with effortless sophistication. The diamond earrings at her ears were modest by the standards of this room, her restraint always intentional, always strategic. She was a picture of control, of quiet dignity, the kind of woman whose presence was felt even when she said nothing. To the casual observer, theirs was a marriage of perfect harmony. The powerful white magnate and his exquisite black wife, a modern-day emblem of progress. It was the kind of union that looked good in magazines, that made for a compelling story in the social pages, that gave Victor an air of forward-thinking refinement in an elite still clinging to the past. But Camille knew better. She knew the subtle shifts in conversation when she entered a room, the glances exchanged over crystal glasses. She recognized the hollow quality of Victor's public praise, the way he framed her intelligence as something charming rather than formidable. She saw how often she was spoken about rather than spoken to, how her presence was acknowledged but not valued. Victor Lancaster did not love her, not in any way that mattered. He loved what she represented, what she did for his image, the illusion she created when she stood beside him. It had not always been this way. Or at least there had been a time when Camille had allowed herself to believe otherwise. She had met Victor in her mid-20s when her ambition burned bright, when she still thought she could carve out a place in the world on her own merit. He had been magnetic then, charming, effortlessly confident, a man who could make a woman feel like she was the only person in the room. She had been drawn to his power, to the sharp intelligence that lurked behind his easy smile, to the way he had spoken about the future with such certainty. He had made her believe they would build something together, that she would be his equal. That illusion had shattered within the first few years of their marriage. The reality had set in slowly, in the small ways at first. The meetings she was excluded from, the decisions made without her input, the way his family regarded her with the quiet, polite distaste of people who tolerated her existence but did not accept it. And then, as time passed, the ways in which he made it clear that his world would always belong to him, that she was a guest in his empire rather than a partner in it. Camille had learned to play her role well. She had mastered the art of the knowing smile, the gracious nod, the silence that was mistaken for obedience. She had built her own quiet power in the shadows, listening, watching, absorbing every detail of how the Lancaster Empire operated. While Victor believed he was shaping her into a woman who knew her place, he had unwittingly handed her the keys to his kingdom. And now, as they stood together at the annual Lancaster Industries Gala, she could feel something shifting beneath the polished surface of the evening. The air was charged in a way she couldn't quite place. the conversations around them taking on a different rhythm. There were glances in her direction that lingered a second too long, hushed murmurs that stopped when she moved closer. She turned slightly, studying Victor's profile as he laughed at something one of his associates had said, his hand resting lightly on the crystal tumbler in his grip. He looked pleased with himself, more so than usual, like a man about to unveil a particularly clever trick. A slow, creeping sense of unease curled in Camille's stomach. And then he turned, his voice cutting through the room like the strike of a bell. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention." The hum of conversation softened, heads turning toward him with the quiet deference that men like Victor expected as a birthright. He raised his glass in a casual salute, flashing the effortless grin that had always made him seem more approachable than he truly was. "Tonight, I have the pleasure of sharing some truly wonderful news," he said, his gaze sweeping the room before settling pointedly on Camille. Her spine straightened, every nerve in her body going taut. "As many of you know, legacy is the foundation of everything we do," he continued. "Our families, our businesses, our traditions, they are what drive us forward, what ensure that our names continue to hold meaning for generations to come." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, men nodding sagely, women smiling indulgently. Victor's smile widened. "And so, it is with great joy that I announce that I will soon be welcoming a new heir into the Lancaster family." For a moment, the words did not register. And then she saw her. Standing near the edge of the crowd, the woman was striking in the way youth often was. Delicate features, a slim frame draped in a gown that shimmered like liquid silver. Blonde, of course, blue-eyed, a face carefully crafted for the pages of society magazines. Isabel Crawford. Camille had seen her before, once or twice, floating at the edges of Victor's world. A socialite with the right last name, the right lineage, the kind of woman his family had always imagined for him. She was also, unmistakably, pregnant. A stunned hush fell over the room, eyes darting between Camille and Victor, waiting, watching. Victor's expression remained perfectly composed, as though he had not just shattered the illusion of their marriage in front of the entire city's elite. Camille felt the weight of every gaze on her, the anticipation, the silent questions. They were expecting a reaction, a gasp, perhaps, a quiet departure, maybe even a drink thrown in his face. But Camille Lancaster had never been the woman they imagined her to be. She let the silence stretch for a moment longer, let them wonder. Then she turned, gliding toward Isabel as smoothly as if she were greeting an old friend. "Congratulations," she said, her voice even, measured. She held out her hand. "You must be thrilled." Isabel hesitated, her pale fingers hovering before she took Camille's hand with the awkward reluctance of someone who had not expected kindness. Victor's smile faltered just slightly. Camille held Isabel's gaze a moment longer, then released her hand and turned away, moving through the crowd with the unhurried grace of a woman who had nothing to prove. She could feel Victor's stare burning into her back, feel the whispers rising in her wake. Let them whisper. She had spent the last 12 years playing the role of the perfect wife. Now, she was done playing, because Victor Lancaster thought he had just taken everything from her. What he didn't know was that she had been waiting for this moment. And soon, he would learn the truth. It had never been his empire. It had always been hers. The drive home was silent. Camille sat in the back seat of the black town car, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face a mask of calm as the city lights blurred past the tinted windows. Victor sat beside her, his long fingers drumming absent-mindedly against his knee. He had not spoken since they had left the gala, had not acknowledged the seismic shift that had taken place in that gilded ballroom. There was no need to. In his mind, it was already settled. He had made his announcement. He had declared the end of their marriage in front of an audience that mattered. And now Camille was expected to fade gracefully, to slip out of his world with a dignified silence, her pockets lined with an expensive settlement that would ensure her comfort and her irrelevance. She could feel his eyes on her, waiting for a reaction that would never come. He wanted anger, wanted tears, wanted some proof that he had wounded her. But Camille had spent too many years learning the art of restraint. She would give him nothing. When the car pulled up to the Lancaster estate, the driver hurried to open the door. Camille stepped out first, the marble steps cool beneath her heels as she ascended to the grand entrance. The house loomed before her, an architectural monument to the Lancaster name, imposing, sprawling, designed to inspire both awe and submission. She had once been impressed by it. Now she saw it for what it was, a gilded cage. Victor followed her inside, his pace leisurely, as though they were merely returning from an ordinary evening out. The foyer was dimly lit, the glow from the crystal chandelier above casting long shadows against the polished floors. "That went well, don't you think?" Victor's voice was smooth, practiced. Camille turned to face him. Her expression did not change, but something in her stillness made him hesitate. "You seem quiet," he said. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. "What is there to say?" Victor studied her, searching for cracks in her composure. When he found none, he sighed, unbuttoning his tuxedo jacket and tossing it over the back of a chair. "You don't have to pretend, Camille. I know this is difficult for you." "Difficult?" she echoed, as if the word amused her. He took a step closer, lowering his voice to something almost sympathetic. "I want to make this as easy as possible. I'm prepared to be generous. You'll be well taken care of." Camille let a slow breath escape through her nose. How effortlessly he erased her. How neatly he rewrote their history in a way that suited him. He had done it so many times before, with other things in smaller ways. But this was different. This was the moment he had been building toward for years, and he believed foolishly that she had not seen it coming. She glanced toward the grand staircase, toward the bedroom that had once been theirs before she had moved into the east wing, a quiet arrangement they had both pretended not to notice. "I think I'll sleep in my own room tonight," she said finally. Victor's smile faltered just slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Of course, I understand." She turned, gliding up the stairs without another word. Once inside her room, she locked the door behind her and moved to the antique writing desk near the window. The city stretched beyond the glass, glittering in the darkness. She reached into the bottom drawer, feeling for the slim leather folder tucked away beneath old letters and stationery. She opened it slowly, her fingers skimming over the neatly typed pages, the signatures at the bottom of each one. The documents that had been placed in her hands 12 years ago, long before Victor had any idea what kind of woman he had married. Camille could still remember the day Richard Lancaster had called her into his office. The old man had been a force of nature, sharp as a blade even in the final years of his life. He had studied her from across his mahogany desk, his hands folded over the cane he no longer needed, but carried anyway, a symbol of his authority. "Victor is my son," he had said, "but he is not the man you think he is." She had sat perfectly still, waiting. "He is arrogant, reckless," Richard continued. "I built this empire with my own hands, and I will not see it dismantled by his impulsiveness. Camille had not known then why he was telling her this. She had assumed, perhaps foolishly, that Richard disapproved of their marriage, that this was his way of warning her away. But then he had slid the documents toward her. "You will have control," he said simply, "not him, not until I'm certain he is ready. And if that day never comes," he had paused, his gaze locking with hers, "then it will be yours to protect." She had not understood, not fully, not then. But she had taken the documents, signed them, placed them in the safety of a vault where Victor would never find them. And now, as she traced her fingers over the ink, she understood what Richard Lancaster had seen all those years ago. He had known that Victor would fail. He had known that his son would be his own undoing. And he had placed his trust in Camille. She closed the folder, exhaling slowly. The weight of it settled into her bones, not as a burden, but as a quiet certainty. Victor believed that tonight had been his victory. He believed that he had orchestrated the perfect betrayal. He had no idea that he was the one who had already lost. Camille rose from the desk, smoothing the fabric of her gown. The night was far from over, and there was much to be done. Tomorrow she would make her first move. Camille woke before dawn. The city outside her window was still wrapped in the hush of early morning, skyscrapers standing in the dim glow of street lights, the world not yet stirring. She sat at her vanity, brushing her hair with slow, deliberate strokes, her reflection calm, composed. It was remarkable how easily she had trained herself to appear unaffected, to mold her features into serenity no matter what storm brewed inside her. The events of the previous night had changed everything. Victor believed he had sealed her fate with his grand announcement, believed that he had backed her into a corner so tight she would have no choice but to accept his terms. He expected her to grieve, to lash out, or worse, to fade into the background of his story like a discarded character no longer relevant to the plot. What he did not expect, what he could never expect, was that the game had never been his to play. She dressed in silence, selecting a deep blue dress that mirrored the color of twilight, elegant but unassuming. She moved through the vast corridors of the Lancaster estate with the grace of someone who had learned to navigate them without being seen. The house had never belonged to her, not truly, not in the way it should have, but she had studied it. She knew its secrets, its weaknesses, the way its walls absorbed sound and its floors betrayed even the softest footfalls. Victor was still asleep when she passed his bedroom. She paused for only a moment, listening to the rhythmic cadence of his breathing, then continued downstairs. In the study, she settled into the high-backed leather chair that had once belonged to Richard Lancaster. The scent of old books and polished wood filled the air, grounding her. She reached into the desk drawer and retrieved the folder she had examined the night before, flipping through the pages with the efficiency of someone who had already memorized every word. Victor's downfall had already begun. He simply didn't know it yet. The first call she made was to her lawyer, Jacob Reed, a man she had kept on retainer for years, quietly preparing for this day. His voice was alert despite the early hour, as if he had been expecting her call. "It's time," she said simply. There was a pause, then a rustle of papers. "You're certain?" "Yes." "Then we move forward. I'll have everything prepared within the hour." She ended the call, allowing herself a single moment to close her eyes, to steady the quiet hum of anticipation beneath her skin. The next call was to Daniel Whitmore, the Chief Financial Officer of Lancaster Industries. Mrs. Lancaster, he greeted cautiously. She rarely called him directly, and the weight of her name in his voice told her he already suspected something was amiss. "There are documents I need you to review," she said. "I'll be sending them over shortly. They pertain to the financial discrepancies in the company's offshore accounts." There was a pause. Then, "I see." She could hear the tension in his voice, the sudden shift in his demeanor as he realized the gravity of what she was saying. He had always been loyal to Victor, or at least he had been loyal to the Lancaster name, but now that loyalty would be tested. "Daniel, I need you to be very clear about where you stand," she said, her tone measured. "This is not a request. This is a directive from the controlling shareholder of Lancaster Industries. You will review the documents. You will confirm the validity of the transactions. And, when the time comes, you will present your findings to the board." Another pause. Then, a quiet exhale. "Understood." She hung up, allowing herself the briefest flicker of satisfaction. The board would be the final battleground, but the pieces were already shifting into place. By the time the sun had fully risen, the estate was stirring. Camille moved through the house with the same quiet control she always had, nodding to the staff, accepting a fresh cup of tea from the housekeeper, who had long since learned to anticipate her preferences. Victor did not emerge from his room until nearly noon. He strolled into the dining room with the unbothered ease of a man who believed he had already won. Dressed in a crisp white shirt, his cufflinks gleaming in the sunlight filtering through the massive windows, he looked every bit the untouchable mogul he imagined himself to be. "Morning," he said smoothly, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "You left early." "I had business to attend to," Camille replied, taking a slow sip of tea. Victor arched an eyebrow. "Business?" She set her cup down, meeting his gaze with unwavering calm. "Yes, business." There was something in the way she said it, something just sharp enough to make his fingers tighten around his coffee cup. "You don't have to pretend," he said after a moment, his tone dipping into condescension. "I know last night wasn't easy for you. But really, Camille, I'm doing you a favor. This transition doesn't have to be difficult. We can be civilized about it." She allowed herself a small, almost indulgent smile. "Civilized," she echoed. Victor sat down across from her, watching her closely. "I've already spoken to my lawyers. They'll be in touch with you about the settlement. You'll find it more than generous." "Generous," she repeated, tilting her head. He sighed as if she were being unreasonable. "Camille, don't drag this out. We both knew this was inevitable." "Inevitable," she mused, as if considering the word. Victor leaned back in his chair, confident now that he had successfully set the terms of their conversation. "I know you, Camille. I know you won't make a scene. You're too smart for that. You'll take the settlement, keep your dignity, and walk away with your head held high." She studied him for a long moment. He was so sure, so utterly convinced that he had already written the ending of this story. She let the silence stretch, let him settle into his own arrogance, and then, in a voice as soft as silk, she said, "I'm not taking your settlement, Victor." The words landed between them like a quiet explosion. His brow furrowed, his fingers stilling against the rim of his coffee cup. "Excuse me?" She picked up her tea, her movements unhurried, and took a slow sip before speaking again. "I said I'm not taking your settlement. Because I won't be leaving, Victor. You will." The color drained from his face, his jaw tightening just slightly. He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Camille, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but "It's not a game," she interrupted, her voice still calm, still smooth. "It's a legal reality. As of this morning, the board has been alerted to your financial misconduct. Every unauthorized offshore transfer, every attempt to funnel company assets into private accounts, it's all documented, verified, and will be presented at an emergency board meeting." The confidence in his eyes flickered just for a second. "I control Lancaster Industries, Victor," she continued, "not you. And as of tomorrow, you will no longer be its CEO. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You have no idea what you're doing." Camille lifted her gaze to meet his, utterly unshaken. "No, Victor. I've known exactly what I was doing for 12 years. The room was silent. For the first time since she had met him, Victor Lancaster looked genuinely afraid. The morning of the emergency board meeting was crisp, the sky over the city a stark blue that stretched endlessly above the steel and glass skyline. Camille stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in her private sitting room, cradling a cup of coffee in her hands as she watched the world move below. From this height, people looked like nothing more than flickering shadows, their movements insignificant against the enormity of the empire she was about to claim. She felt the moment Victor awoke. Even across the vast Lancaster estate, she could sense it in the subtle shift of the house's energy, the way the staff moved with newfound caution, as if anticipating an unseen storm. He had not spoken to her since their conversation the previous morning, since she had looked him in the eye and told him what he had never once considered possible. That she, not he, held the power, that she had always held it. The board meeting was scheduled for 9. At 8:45, she descended the marble staircase with the unhurried grace of someone who knew she had already won. She could hear Victor in the study, his voice low and urgent as he spoke on the phone. He was calling in every favor, every connection he still believed he had, trying to gather enough support to stop what was coming. Camille did not stop to listen. It no longer mattered. A car was waiting for her outside, sleek and black, its polished surface reflecting the towering facade of the Lancaster estate. The driver opened the door for her, and as she slid into the cool leather seat, she allowed herself one final glance at the house she had lived in for over a decade. The house Victor had assumed would always be his. It was not the house itself she would miss. It was the way she had once imagined it might become a home. The headquarters of Lancaster Industries was a monolithic structure of steel and glass, an architectural testament to wealth and power. The executive boardroom occupied the entire west side of the top floor, a cavernous space lined with dark wood and adorned with portraits of past Lancaster patriarchs. Camille had been in this room countless times, always as Victor's wife, always as an accessory rather than a participant. Today, that changed. She stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, and met the eyes of the men who had controlled this company for decades. Some of them had known Richard Lancaster personally. Others had been handpicked by Victor in his quest to shape the company in his image. All of them had underestimated her. Victor was already there, seated at the head of the long mahogany table. His suit was flawless, his hair perfectly in place, but there was a tension in his posture that he could not hide. He had been fighting against this moment for the past 24 hours, exhausting every possible strategy to prevent it. The only thing left for him now was denial. "Camille," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "you're early." She moved to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the company's most senior board members. She took her time settling in, placing her portfolio in front of her, adjusting the cuff of her silk blouse. "I prefer to be prepared," she said. A murmur moved through the room. She saw the way some of the men exchanged glances, the way others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had read the documents. They had seen the numbers. They knew what was coming. The chairman, Harold Winters, cleared his throat. He was an old friend of Richard Lancaster's, a man whose loyalty had always been dictated by pragmatism rather than sentiment. Today, pragmatism was not in Victor's favor. "We have a great deal to discuss this morning," Harold said, adjusting his reading glasses as he glanced down at the stack of papers before him. "Mrs. Lancaster has brought to our attention a series of financial irregularities that require immediate review." Victor let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "This is absurd. We are not going to waste time on baseless accusations." Camille lifted a single brow. "Baseless?" Victor's jaw clenched, but he forced a smile. "Camille, I don't know what you think you found, but I assure you, you're mistaken." She opened her portfolio and pulled out the first document, sliding it across the table toward Harold. "This is the first unauthorized offshore transfer. It was made 6 months ago, disguised as an expansion investment." Harold picked up the paper, scanning it with a practiced eye. His expression remained impassive, but Camille saw the way his fingers tightened around the edges of the page. She slid forward another document. This one was processed 3 months ago, another investment. The funds, of course, never returned. More papers, more transactions, each one an undeniable piece of evidence. Victor's carefully constructed composure cracked. "Enough," he snapped, pushing back from the table. "This is ridiculous. These are routine transfers, perfectly legal. If you had any real understanding of how this company operates, you would know that." Camille tilted her head, studying him. "Routine?" She turned to Harold. "Mr. Winters, as chairman, would you care to explain why these routine transfers were never disclosed to the board?" Harold set the papers down, his gaze shifting to Victor. "I'd like an answer to that as well." The room fell into a heavy silence. Victor's fingers curled into fists at his sides. "This is a coup," he said, his voice low, furious. "She's manipulating you. She doesn't belong in this room, and you all know it." Camille smiled then, slow and deliberate. "I belong here more than you ever did," she said. Victor's breath came sharp and fast through his nose. "You think you can take this from me? You think the board will back you over me?" "I don't think," Camille said softly. "I know." Harold cleared his throat again, looking at Camille with something that almost resembled respect. "As of this morning, legal counsel has reviewed the company's governing documents. It appears Mrs. Lancaster's claim is valid. She holds controlling interest through the trust established by Richard Lancaster." Victor went utterly still. Harold turned back to the board. "Given the evidence presented, I move to put to a vote the immediate removal of Victor Lancaster as CEO of Lancaster Industries." The motion was seconded. The vote was unanimous. Victor staggered back a step, his breath coming shallow. "You can't do this." Camille stood, gathering her papers with smooth efficiency. "It's already done." She stepped past him, the weight of his downfall settling into the room like a tangible force. Victor had spent his life believing power was his birthright, that his name alone was enough to keep him untouchable. Today, he learned the truth. Power was not given. It was taken. The echoes of the boardroom's decision followed Camille as she stepped into the quiet sanctuary of her private office. The walls of glass framed the city skyline, the view stretching far beyond the limits of Lancaster Industries, far beyond the reach of the man she had just unseated. She set her portfolio down with meticulous care, her fingers grazing over the smooth leather as she allowed herself the smallest moment of stillness. The enormity of what she had just done settled into her bones, not as a burden, but as a confirmation. She had waited years for this moment, prepared for it with patience that Victor had mistaken for passivity. Now, the empire was hers. A knock at the door broke the silence. She turned, already knowing who it would be. Harold Winters stepped inside, his expression measured. He had been a formidable force in Richard Lancaster's era, a man who had seen the company through its most turbulent transitions. He had also been Victor's most pragmatic ally, siding with him when it was convenient, but never with blind loyalty. Now, he regarded Camille with the curiosity of a man reevaluating everything he thought he knew. "You handled yourself well," he said, closing the door behind him. Camille tilted her head slightly. "Did you expect otherwise?" His mouth twitched in something close to amusement. "I expected Victor to put up more of a fight." "He still might," she said simply. Harold studied her for a moment, then nodded. "The official transition will take time, but the vote was clear. The board is behind you." "For now," Camille murmured, but she met his gaze steadily. "And you?" Harold leaned against the edge of the desk, his posture deceptively relaxed. "I knew Richard didn't trust his son," he admitted, "but I didn't know he trusted you." "Neither did Victor," she said. Harold exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "He should have." Camille said nothing. She had no interest in Victor's regrets, in the lessons he had learned too late. Harold straightened. "What's next?" She glanced down at the stack of documents on her desk, then back at him. "We rebuild," she said. "The damage Victor has done to this company runs deeper than offshore accounts and missing funds. We need to restore trust within the company, within the market, within our investors." Harold nodded. "You'll have opposition?" "I expect nothing less." His gaze lingered on her for a beat longer before he gave a short nod. "I'll leave you to it then." As he exited, Camille allowed herself a deep breath. The weight of responsibility was vast, but it was one she had chosen, one she had earned. A chime from her phone pulled her attention back to the present. A message from Jacob Reed, her lawyer. "Victor has demanded a meeting. In private." Of course he had. She sent a single-word response. "Fine." The confrontation was inevitable. She chose a quiet lounge in the Lancaster Tower for the meeting, one far removed from the executive offices, away from prying eyes. When she arrived, Victor was already there, his posture stiff, his jaw tight. He looked different, less polished, less assured. The illusion of control had been stripped away, leaving behind a man who had only now realized just how much he had lost. She took a seat across from him, folding one leg over the other, waiting. Victor exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You think you've won." She arched a brow. "Haven't I?" His fingers curled into fists against the table. "You don't belong here." Camille smiled, slow and deliberate. "And yet, here I am." He leaned forward, his voice low, sharp. "You don't know what this company is, what it takes to run it." "You mean I don't know what it takes to run it into the ground?" she countered, tilting her head. "Because that's what you were doing." Victor's jaw clenched. "This is personal for you." "No," she said evenly, "this is business. You made it personal when you tried to erase me." His silence was telling. "I'll fight this," he said finally. Camille nodded, as if considering it. "You could, but you won't win." Victor let out a short, humorless laugh. You think I don't have allies? I think you overestimate them, she replied, just as you overestimated yourself. His gaze darkened. What do you want? She regarded him for a long moment before answering. I want you gone. His lips pressed into a thin line. You will retain your personal assets, she continued, your properties, your investments, what you earned before your fraud began, but you will remove yourself from Lancaster Industries, permanently. Victor leaned back, exhaling through his nose. And if I refuse? She took her time before responding. Then you lose everything. His eyes narrowed. Meaning, she said calmly. I will ensure that every detail of your financial misconduct is turned over to the authorities, meaning the Lancaster name will not just be disgraced, it will be criminal. His knuckles whitened against the table. She leaned forward slightly. You have 1 day to decide. Victor's jaw worked, his breath uneven. For the first time in his life, he had no leverage. Camille rose, smoothing her blouse. I'll expect your answer by morning. She turned, walking away without waiting for a response. By the time she returned to the upper floors, the news was already spreading. The press release had gone out. Camille Lancaster was now the official CEO of Lancaster Industries. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from an unexpected source. Isabel Crawford. Camille hesitated for only a moment before opening it. I need to talk to you. Please. A part of her considered ignoring it. Isabel had been complicit, whether knowingly or not. But another part of her, the part that understood what it meant to be used, to be underestimated, considered otherwise. She typed a reply. Come to my office. When Isabel arrived, she looked different, less polished, her movements uncertain. She was still wearing the remnants of the life Victor had promised her, but now she seemed to realize those promises had been empty. I don't expect you to forgive me, Isabel said quietly. Camille studied her. Good. A flicker of something passed through Isabel's expression, but she nodded. I didn't know. Not about the company, not about any of it. Camille sighed. And now? Now, I want to make sure my child doesn't grow up believing the same lies I did. Camille's gaze softened slightly. Then you already know what you need to do. Isabel nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. He's never going to forgive me for this. Camille exhaled. He doesn't have to. Isabel swallowed, then straightened. Thank you for at least hearing me out. Camille inclined her head. Be careful. As Isabel left, Camille turned back to the city outside her window. Victor was gone. The company was hers, and this was only the beginning. Subscribe to our channel to see more stories of power, betrayal, and redemption. Watch our next video to uncover more compelling tales, and don't forget to share this one with others.